Thank you. Thank you all for indulging me in English today. Also, thanks to Chen and CCA and Ron and the Digital Arts Center for inviting me. And thanks to Leah for agreeing to participate in the conversation. And thank you for all of you for being here. I usually don't read lectures. It's always been, this is a new thing for me to sort of function as a semi-art historian, but today I'm going to do it just because I think some of the issues are complicated, both in terms of complicated artist projects, complicated politics, and in the end you'll see a little bit of some theoretical models that I found it easiest to address through writing. So. The idea for the topic of this lecture started when I was giving a talk to Gilad Efrat's class at Shenkar last year. The talk looked at works like Yael Bartana's trilogy, Khalid Hourani's Picasso in Palestine project, and my argument that the Gaza flotilla acted as a kind of artivism, combining art and activism. But two reactions came from the students. One was, why should art be political? And two, if it was political, why do I, as an American, care? And implicitly, what right do I have to speak about the political situation of a place that I do not live? So when Chen invited me to speak about a topic, I decided to take on these questions directly, and I'm very excited to talk about them with Leah and with you, the audience. I'm going to talk about some examples of art, activism, and theory as models of addressing these questions through the perspectives of an outsider. I know that many of you might be familiar with these projects and ideas, and for that I apologize, but I'll be talking about them and try to make an argument that I hope is at least slightly new or at least productive. I also know that Israel-Palestine cannot and should not be reduced to its political problems. This place and your identity is obviously much more complex, and for the most part exists through the practice of everyday life. But as I'll talk about later, the issue of avoiding the politics of everyday life can also be problematic, as it has the potential to normalize the systems of the occupation. Finally, I'll be talking about artist and activist projects to set up a conversation with both Leah and you, and I welcome any feedback you have. So first, the question of the relationship between art and politics. For those who exist within this discourse, social practice or social sculpture, it's often considered a tired question. But in short, I reject the transcendence of art from the social and political realities in which it is made and experienced. This Enlightenment-based humanist argument is ultimately grounded in the assumption that art is only about beauty and universal truths when it actually is also connected to positions of power. Secondly, I also reject Adorno's argument for autonomy, which, while Marxist in its intentions, believes that resistance can be found through separatism, segregating artworks from the politics of everyday life. Both of these positions come from a belief that artworks can exist as a state of exception. Rather, I'm more aligned to a situationist attitude suspect of the spectacle of capital and its need for artworks to create passive spectators. The truth is that this is also a reaction to a reaction, something too fixed in its ideology, and I hope to complicate that a little bit later with a more fluid model. But let's start with an artwork that addresses these issues and these larger questions within the context of Israel-Palestine. So this is Francis Alys's sometimes doing something poetic can become political, and sometimes doing something political can become poetic. As many of you know, this project from 2007 involves Alys walking along the Green Line in the Jerusalem area and marking it with a dripping can of paint. This performance became a video, which was an artwork in itself in the context of a larger installation shown at both the Israel Museum and David's Werner Gallery. The video could be seen either in silence or with only the ambient sounds of his walks, or it could be seen with voiceovers from interviews with intellectuals, activists, politicians, and journalists, which are also transcribed in the exhibition catalog. For instance, in one interview with the activist Michael Warchowski, Alys asked him if some aspect of poetic or artistic intervention is relevant, and he says, one level of this question is interference. I believe that there are situations in which you can't move ahead without the intervention from the outside. So I have a brief clip, just so you get a little bit of a sense. And second. Okay, so other interviews in this included Amira Haas, the anthropologist Rima Hamami, Yael Dayan, and filmmaker A.L. Sivan, and others. But the core of this project is an investigation of a simple thing, a line drawn with a green pencil on a map that gets translated into a provisional border, a border that at least at some points of both time and space becomes more evident than others. The performance of drawing or painting the line is a trace of a walk along the border, and the video which records the social landscape on which this line is drawn makes the line evident and refuses its erasure. This walk, this trace of both an historical and contemporary action, depicts the Green Line as a piece of unfinished business, especially since freedom of movement is a key issue for Palestinians. Of course, this issue is not just about freedom of movement for Palestinians, but it was predicated on a Belgian artist who's based in Mexico, coming to Israel-Palestine, and walking through a space with the knowledge that if he's stopped for any reason, he has a passport that can act as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Another project related to an outsider moving through and observing the politics of space is by Marine Hugonnier, which originated from a 2004 group show Territories, organized by Anselm Frank, A.L. Weitzman, and Rafi Segal, and Stefano Boeri. It traveled to Malmo, Berlin, and Tel Aviv. The third venue in Tel Aviv included a week-long series of events, including lectures by local and international practitioners, debates and screenings in various locations across both sides of the Green Line. This series of events attempted to narrate political and strategic issues through the physical relics of the occupation. Architecture was described as the physical embodiment of the conflict, where landscape and its mapping are used to serve ideological purposes. A bus tour was also organized at West Bank and Palestine, and according to Hugonnier, this journey through a physical reality was the true core of the exhibition, and Territory 1, 2, and 3 is a three-part film relating to this experience. Part 1 is a silent portrait of the White City, focusing on its modernist Bauhaus-esque architecture. Part 2 includes footage from the bus tour, and Part 3 is a filmic portrait of an old house in Ramallah. Part 2 combines a number of images that are common for artists that come from the outside with a voiceover. Hugonnier collaborated with A.L. Weitzman on the text, and the result is something like Chris Marker's Sans Soleil, a poetic and political travelogue. There are images of the wall again and settlements, forms of architecture that signify the landscape of occupation, but there are also images that are distinctly Orientalist and relatively uncomplicated by the artist. A minaret, an Arab boy on a donkey, and olive trees. Hugonnier is aware that this is all a form of tourism, and when it's driven by leftist or activist principles, it has the danger of becoming a kind of colonialism, because many outsiders come to the Holy Land with a preconceived idea and look for images that fulfill those preconceptions. This was the basis of Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, and Hugonnier's voiceover carries with it the contradictions and problematics of her position. But in my mind, she's also enacting a kind of conflict tourism, aware of her Orientalism, but unable to stop it from rearing its ugly head. Have a quick clip.
Architects, sociologists, and political activists on a bus tour through the reality of the occupation. Everything during this bus tour, the speaker, and the stop at viewpoints to experience the scenery, was similar to the tourist tours which have taken place for years in the Holy Land. The first stop was on a hill overlooking Bethlehem, opening onto a panorama where Christian pilgrimages marvel at biblical imagery. Where are those pilgrims arriving with messianic conviction and utopian ideas, the predecessors of Zionism?
Okay, so many activist organizations rely on the outsider. Through much of the bus tour, we can hear and see Jeff Halper, who is that voice in the distance, who is basically giving the tour to everybody. And he's giving a tour of what he calls the matrix of control. When I first saw this film, I couldn't help but think of my own experiences volunteering in 2008 for a work camp run by Jelf Halper's organization, the Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolitions. I had come here to research Yael Bartana's summer camp, which was based on a 2006 work camp that she had observed. This work camp brings mostly international activists to rebuild demolished Palestinian houses in the West Bank, mostly in the village of Anata. But the building is just one part of a larger strategy to make the matrix of the occupation visible. There are bus tours, very much like the one in Hugonnier's film, where Halper brings this group to see settlements, the wall, the threat of the occupation on Israeli Palestinians in places like Lod or the Bedouins of the Negev. While I found the educational portion dogmatic and somewhat repetitive at times, it was crucial for many in the group who came to fulfill a vague solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. That year, almost all the funding came from the Spanish Communist Party, which sent a youth group of about 20 people. One of them nicknamed himself Javier Jihad, who regularly compared Israelis to Nazis. Not everyone in the group was like this, but one evening when a representative from Breaking the Silence came, a couple of Spanish diasporic Palestinians attacked him for being a monster. ICAD also became a gateway for other activist organizations like Anarchists Against the Wall and the International Solidarity Movement. One night, a group of ICAD volunteers went to a house in Beit Hanina that was under threat of demolition. The idea was that if there is an international presence, then potentially there might be less violence, and in addition that the event of the 4 a.m. eviction and subsequent demolition of the house could be recorded. But one thing that I learned in this time with activists is that it has an aesthetic or performative norms. There are the soldiers who mill around or create a wall or cordon off an area. There are Palestinian elders who pray to signify their resistance. And there are Palestinian young people who rush to confront the soldiers, often held back by the elders for fear that they might also get arrested. There are the journalists, a combination of local stringers and outsiders. And there are the activists from Germany or Spain who wear the keffiyeh as a stylish symbol of solidarity. One artist who spent a good deal of time here, who is quite enamored with the aesthetics of politics, or more particularly the aesthetics of the administration of dissent, is the Polish artist Artur Zmijewsky. His video installation Democracies includes 20 videos from protests around the world, mostly in Germany, Poland, and Israel-Palestine. You see the shouting, the slogans, the signs from very different political positions. Most of the ones from here might be familiar to you, not only from protests, but also the proliferation of protest imagery in both the traditional and social media. In 2012, Zmijewsky was the curator for the Berlin Biennial, a project that explicitly sought to blur the boundaries between art and activism and included a number of works related to Israel-Palestine. One project was the Key of Return, co-curated by the residents of the Aida refugee camp, Khalid Hourani, director of the International Art Academy in Palestine, and Tolin Tuk, independent curator from Palestine and Jordan. In 2008, for the 60th anniversary of the Nakba, a group of activists from the camp made a 10-meter-long key, the paradigmatic symbol of the lost home and the right of return, and placed it at the entrance to the Aida refugee camp. The Key of Return project involves ceremoniously taking the key down, placing it on a truck, driving it to a ship and another truck, which took it to Berlin, where it was installed at the center of the KV. Workshops were held with Palestinian youths in Berlin and the Aida refugee camp to discuss the issues of homeland, memory, and contemporary identity in light of the past and present. Zmijewsky is known for projects that can seem manipulative and objectifying in his subjects. They've including a remounting of the infamous Stanford experiment, in which volunteers play the roles of inmates and guards, filming blind people making paintings, and a Holocaust survivor that Zmijewsky convinces to, quote-unquote, renew his tattoo. In the case of the Key of Return, one can argue that he's trying to make visible Palestinian activism in an act of solidarity through an elaborate performative gesture. But on the other hand, you could say that he was once again looking for a subaltern subject to objectify and use. I think that Khalid Hourani was aware that Zmijewsky was using him and believed that he and his co-curator and the activist partners from Aida could use the biennial as a platform for their own brand of activism. The problem is that I'm not sure that it worked. The budget was too small in the end to fund the educational activities at the camp that were promised, and it reinscribed the fetish of the key as the preeminent symbol of the Nakba. Phil Collins was commissioned by the Al-Mamal Foundation in Jerusalem to make a project entitled They Who Shoot Horses, Don't They? A project that involved organizing and filming a disco dance marathon in Ramallah. It was meant to evoke exhaustion, collapse, and heroism through the frame of the relatively frivolous stuff of pop culture. Collins was trying to move away from the aesthetics of protest and politics that artists like Zmijewsky are drawn to. He also wanted to avoid what he saw as the popular media depiction of Palestinians as uncivilized and wanted to show, quote-unquote, beauty under duress, entertainment in place of routine indignities. From 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., he played Beyoncé, The Smiths, and Joy Division, interrupted periodically by the call to prayer and occasional power cuts. He says, quote, "I wanted everyone who saw it to fall in love with them, to admire their perseverance and to wonder why it should seem odd to us if they knew the words of Althea and Donna's Uptown Top ranking. The last track they danced to is quite rightly Olivia Newton-John's Xanadu. For me, there's really a heroism to live in a place it's impossible to leave, to be split from families, imprisoned by a Berlin Wall, and maybe worst of all, to be forgotten by a world which refuses to understand you," unquote. As you can hear from his intentions, the project is meant to be a kind of activism, but he's resisting the usual tropes that plague the aesthetics of activism. This is still a model of an artist, in this case British, making the journey here to record or reveal certain qualities that exist on the ground here to an international audience. Finally, I'd like to talk about a project that was made in the US and shown in the US, in New York, about the complex relationship between Israeli architecture and the US military. Much like Marine Hugonnier's piece, Daniel Joseph Martinez was greatly influenced by A.L. Weitzman, the architectural theorist who teaches at Goldsmiths, when he made The West Bank is Missing, I Am Not Dead, Am I?, which was exhibited at the James Gallery at Hunter College in 2008. This project is about the influence of the gated suburban communities in Irvine, California, where Martinez teaches, on settlement architecture in the West Bank. He made two large wheel-like structures, each with clear, vacuum-formed plexiglass renditions of architectural plans. One was based on plans lifted literally from A.L. Weitzman's book Hollowland, and the other was based on plans from Irvine. Martinez was interested in the ways in which Irvine's gated communities were planned to deal with the question of race, ethnicity, and immigration in Southern California. As he told me, not only were these towns designed to keep the brown people out, they were designed to create a civilian extension from the military roots of Irvine, which was founded around an Air Force base. He believes that the architectural systems of control are an analog to the $3 billion a year of military financing that the U.S. sends to Israel to implicitly support the occupation and further the conditions of empire. This piece starts to undo clear distinctions between inside and outside when it comes to the U.S. relationship to Israel-Palestine. In a similar but much more politicized way than last year's Israeli pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennial, which took its title from a statement by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who said that, quote, "Israel since the 1970s was the largest American aircraft carrier in the world," unquote. These trends suggest the permeability of national boundaries in an age of neoliberal global capital, but are there situations where this fluidity could be interrupted? One of the most difficult and important issues that I've had to tackle in my work on art and politics of this region is the question of the BDS movement. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions has many manifestations and often is referred to not only as anti-Israel but also anti-Semitic. This is especially prescient in ways that I couldn't have predicted given the recent EU settlement guidelines and Gidon Levy's declaration in Haaretz of his support of the boycott. I've been interested in the ways that Judith Butler, an intellectual, this Butler on the left, an intellectual who began her career as a pioneering queer feminist, has recently turned to the question of Israel-Palestine. Last year, she received an invitation by a student group at Brooklyn College to talk along with Omar Barghouti on the right, who literally wrote the book on BDS. This provoked an angry outcry from members of the U.S. Congress, New York State legislators, the Brooklyn City Council, the New York Daily News, and Alan Dershowitz, the outspoken Harvard professor of law who's taken on himself to be the intellectual protector of Israel. Some wrote a letter asking for the political science department to rescind its co-sponsored funding from the event. Some called for Butler not being allowed to speak. And some of the politicians involved suggesting that funding for the college could be at stake. Brooklyn College was attacked for not being balanced, saying they should have a representative of both sides of the issue, as if there were two sides. This provoked counter-protests in support of free speech and human rights. Finally, the New York Times, as Alan Dershowitz on the left, the New York Times, New York Governor and Mayor of New York on the right came to her and Brooklyn College's defense when he suggested, quote, "If you want to go to a university where the government decides what kind of subjects are fit for discussion, I suggest you apply to a school in North Korea," unquote. Butler's lecture that day echoed many of the ideas in her recent book, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism. Butler has tried to argue that criticism of Israel is not only not anti-Semitic, but actually rooted in a Jewish intellectual history that is against state violence. Drawing on Hannah Arendt, Emmanuel Levinas, and Walter Benjamin, as well as Edward Said, she charts out the Jewish imperative towards social justice that can be applied to the occupation, internal inequalities within Israel that are based on race and class, the violent bombardments of Gaza and Lebanon, and threats towards Iran. So she's arguing for her and other intellectuals, activists and artists that are diasporic Jews to speak against the occupation and even actively resist it through support of BDS. Furthermore, Butler resists the potential exceptionalism that not only Jewish values support such social justice, showing that not only do Jewish values support Jewish and non-Jewish activists, but she also offers a range of other models that mirror the Jewish values that she describes. So she tries to counter Jewish Zionism with Jewish anti-Zionism because it seems like a strategy to offer critique from within a system, but resists the temptation to offer Jewish thinking as the only model, thereby constantly refusing any fixed ideological position from which all critique emanates. To me, this instinct is related to her contribution to feminism, where she offered a queer perspective that undid the clear binaries between both sex and gender. In her book, Gender Trouble, she troubled the rhetoric with which we understand gender to be performed. She showed that there are multiple gender positions and multiple desires, showed how gender positions are performed through both our bodies and language. So these multiple desires go beyond male-female, masculine-feminine, and even gay-straight. She's often been misrepresented as a theory of drag, but she was trying to show how performativity includes not only a man dressing as a woman, or a woman dressing or acting as a man, but also to show how a man acts like a man. Jose Esteban Munoz has talked about Vaginal Davis's character Clarence, a male white supremacist played by a black gay male artist, as an example of finding a third position that moves outside of clear binaries. Without explicitly making analogies between queer or straight positions, I'd like to argue that Butler is offering a queer model of critique to shift the rhetoric surrounding art and activism in Israel-Palestine. In her essay on critique, she asks, what is it to offer a critique? She says that it's always a critique of some instituted practice, discourse, or institution. She distinguishes between critique and criticism in the following way. Criticism is a form of judgment performed from afar from a fixed position, while critique exists only in relation to something other than itself. So critique is about relationships and resists the fixed binaries between categories. This is how critique is linked to the possibility of change, because if the object of critique is not forever fixed in one position, it can be transformed into something else. Similarly, if critique is predicated on fluid boundaries between its subject and object, then the categories of an insider and outsider begin to blur. So in this context of Israel-Palestine, who is the insider? Who is the outsider? How do we take into consideration diasporic Jews or Palestinians, foreign workers, or those that are in the process of converting to Judaism to adequately fulfill their law of return? If we listen to Butler and a notion that she borrows from Said, it is precisely this diasporic condition which offers the possibility of not criticism but critique as a form of resistance. I think that Alys's project offers a critique of the situation by invoking a set of local voices and local landscapes, and becomes a part of it by walking in it and entering an open discourse with these people, revealing a condition of illegitimate authority. I I think that Martinez's project is critique because it was about the interconnectedness between urbanism and the military-industrial complex that is in a bizarre feedback loop between the US and Israel. It revealed a condition of complicity in which he felt compelled to both critique and resist, not as an outsider, but as an insider. And finally, I think that the boycott offers a unique form of critique, especially in the case of the recent EU decision, because it forces the current government to acknowledge the interdependency between an economy and military of Israeli society within the occupation. But I don't think that the calls to boycott the Creative Times Summit last year, because of the participation of the Israeli Center for Digital Art, was true critique. I think that it became an instance of criticism, refusing to see the radical politics that have been supported by the center. I'm a great admirer of both the work done by many of the practitioners and institutions here, including both the center and CCA, and I hope that this talk can open up some discourse that can be productive. And speaking to the audience of Brooklyn College, Butler said, quote, "There must be enormous fear behind the drive to censorship, but also enormous aggression. If we were all in a war where speech has suddenly become artillery, is there another way to approach language and speech as we think about this issue? Is it possible that some other use of words might forestall violence, bring about a general ethos of nonviolence, and so enact and open onto the conditions for a public discourse that welcomes and shelters disagreement, even disarray?" Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. I think it's a privilege for me to kind of address this issue. I think it's a very, very important one. And before I ask you anything, I just want to say a few things that came to my mind when I read your lecture and when we talked about it too much, maybe. So I think this topic of kind of this tension between outsiders and insiders, I tried to come up with a word for it in Hebrew and couldn't. If you have any suggestions for a word for an outsider or insider, I don't know. But I think it's a very important tension or binary in terms of not only the state of Israel, but also of art in general, and also specifically to Israeli art. I think if we take, when I think of this binary between outsider and insider in terms of living here in the state of Israel, I feel like I live in a place that's always trying to push people out, like kind of trying to make it as hard as it can be to get in, to actually be an insider. And once you do become an insider here, you have this enormous commitment to the community, and you have to fulfill the kind of obligations that an insider has. That's my general feeling, and we could talk about it later. With art, and I'm kind of referencing what you said, I think it is a very inclusive practice, as I see it, as always trying to add other aspects, other fields to it, actually trying to be non-art a lot of the time. But it still exists as a kind of, in a state of exception, really, which allows for this inclusiveness gesture, right? So it's moving within this binary of outside and inside. And specifically to Israeli art, I think, and this is probably not new to any of you, this kind of tension, that Sal Breitbeck talks about, or Sarachinski after that, between the here and there, us and them, this imaginary there that we came from and that we're going to, is vital to Israeli art, to its history, to its current, practice. So all of this kind of came to mind, and I think that's why it's important to talk about this. Especially given the fact that Israeli art was created as a Zionist project, and it's only in recent years that it's kind of beginning to separate from it, or trying to be something else. And this is by blurring this kind of here and now, here and there, a binary. what I did was I kind of searched the etymology, the history of the words insider and outsider, and what I found out was really interesting, because I found out that actually the word insider was created in the late 19th century, mid-19th century, for describing a subversive act. It actually was you described as someone from the stock market having insider information. Right? So this was used to describe someone that once he's inside, he's part of an organization or part of a system, he can serve as a spy or as a traitor to that same system. So it's actually the insider who has the subversive potential of breaking the system from within, and not the outsider is just someone that's isolated, that's outside, according to the etymology of the word, right? Not in general. But the insider, that's why maybe here there's such a fear from people becoming insiders, because then you have the knowledge, you have the practice, you have everything, and you can use that, right? So you become a potential trader in that instance of becoming an insider. And it's interesting to think of art and artists in that perspective of jumping between this and that definition. And picking up on your last sentences about Butler's suggestion of using other words, then maybe we can think of other terms that we can use that are based on this outsider insider, but maybe there's this thing as someone that's inside out, like an outfit, I don't know, or really think about what an insider is. Is it about our language? Is it about our education system, our value system? Really kind of try to unpack these two terms. I think it's really about taking sides, right, and inside and outside, but it's also about movement from side to side. Can we talk about insiderhood or outsiderness? Can we multiply it? Inside, yeah. Is there a thing as a double-sided something? So that's my general perspective on that. And the first question I want to ask you is a bit personal, and you can choose to answer however you want, of course. But I wanted to ask you, based on your own personal history, what are the moments where you feel like an outsider or an insider to this area? And in those moments, why do you think these definitions are necessary? Why do we need an outsider? Why do we need an insider? And how are these roles performed? How do you perform them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of simple but complicated question, and without going sort of too much in detail, I grew up coming here quite regularly with my family. I went to sort of Jewish day schools in various places in London and New York. The curriculum was half in Hebrew. They were Orthodox schools, and I left the States for a while to live in Jerusalem. I sort of went through a process of becoming secular, and actually just the other day I was in Jerusalem on my way back from, on my way to Ramallah to meet with some artists, and I was sitting in this cafe next to a few sort of American Jews that had lived there for 10, 12 years. I knew this because they were talking very loudly about themselves, they had to prove in some ways within their conversation how somehow they were saying Israel is not a racist society, like Jews inherently can't be racist. It's not like like this woman here, like she's wearing this shirt, like she could never wear this shirt in Ramallah. I mean, Ramallah used to be like the most liberal place, but today like the fundamentalists have taken over, and she would get stoned for wearing this shirt. And I had this sort of simultaneous moment of feeling like an insider and an outsider to that conversation, because I used to live with these people. To some extent I was sitting next to them. I'm someone who comes back, but in a different way. And just to that extent, I do feel a little like a double-sided spy. And know that that I was listening, but didn't want to intervene directly. But that's sort of one of a number of moments that sometimes that can happen.
It can happen also when I know what's going on in Beirut and you're going there and I can't.
Yes.
So I'm using you as a journalist. Okay, the other question would be, does anyone have a question? We can do questions like in between. No?
Yes.
Yeah.
Rather clear or boring? Not yet. Okay, Ronan.
If I understood correctly, you were talking about these artists as outsiders, but I think they're very much insiders. They were the insiders of the art world.
Sure.
And they kind of, I want to ask why, like, all the artists you chose are artists that are revalidated as they are an important artist.
Sure.
Therefore, the work they do must be important because we already decided. But there are dozens of projects that were done before them that were very similar, but maybe they were by activists, or
sure.
people didn't call themselves artists who were now important artists by
sure.
the art world. So I'm not really sure why, I'm kind of asking why you took the choice, because also like then these projects went back to this inside world. They didn't really touch the politics. They went wherever they were shown
sure.
in these galleries. And I was kind of even saying kind of disappointed by these choices.
Sure.
Because I was kind of I was wanting to learn something new.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one, I feel like I've encountered some other projects by people that are less well known. But I think one thing that I'm interested in is both the fluidity and transaction of representations that can function outside of a local condition, and to some extent, the insiderness of these artists has allowed for for some of the ideas and for some of the representations of these political positions to move beyond the local. To some degree, there's an aspect of cultural capital that's at stake there, and there's no doubt about it, and actual capital that supports that cultural capital. But this is kind of the analog to the question, about the relationship between, actual capital and political power in relationship to, sorry for getting so jargon heavy, but like systems of subjugation. That essentially there's two sides to it. Like, I think that yes, everyone is complicit, right? This was what I was talking about in the very beginning, is that I don't think that any of these artists or any artist trying are necessarily more pure, whether they're well known or not. Like if someone that no one's ever paid attention to doesn't necessarily mean that it's, a truer thing or more original, right? Like, is the originality the thing that is at stake, or is the ideas that are represented and the transmission of that representation? And if we stick to the originality, then I think that we're kind of getting sucked back into ultimately like an older model that's tied to a notion of genius and self-expression. And this is not about originality. This is about really trying to convey a series of ideas in hopefully a way that is maybe not new within a system of artistic representation, but certainly in relationship to like the dominant media like CNN or Al Jazeera.
Can you give an example of that? Like, what in CNN and Al Jazeera they talked about the key of Artur Zmijewsky bringing.
Wait,
are there examples of this really happening?
No. I'm saying that like CNN and Al Jazeera want literally like hot images. Like I was in Beirut, for instance, I had this conversation with a woman that runs a website called Mashallah News. Mashallah News was basically started by a group of young journalists in their 20s that literally they work as stringers for the major news organizations around the world. And they kept on pitching these stories about life in Beirut or other parts of Lebanon that basically their editors didn't want because they didn't have violence in them. They didn't have political parties that were at war. Ultimately, they were more about sort of indirect, more subtle kinds of ways of living. And so what they did is started a new publication that would allow those possibilities. So I guess what I was saying about something like even the most famous, I think, of all those projects, which is the Francis Alys piece, is that the Francis Alys piece, especially if you watch the actual video, which is rather long, it's a guy walking down a path for a long time in a way that for most sort of mainstream news is rather boring. There could be ways where it could be encapsulated in such a way where it could work for those mainstream news organizations. But even the possibility that in its original, it acted as a DVD which had 12 different interviews that could be possible. And each one of them ran the length of the entire video. That's something that doesn't exist within a news cycle that needs things that are very quick and a soundbite. So to me, those are... The opposition is between something that can be a 2-minute or a 30-second bit, which has very clear priorities. This is a good guy, this is a bad guy, this is this horrible thing that happened. And that's what sort of capitalist news organizations need and want, versus other projects which are sort of more complex and longer. Does that answer? Maybe not satisfy.
He's criticizing you.
I heard that.
Okay, so I want to go back to the question of critique and criticism.
Yeah.
And this is something I'm happy to hear from everyone here their thoughts about. I was thinking lately about what kind of critical tones do we use, or do we use, or what kind of critical attitudes do we support, do we tolerate, and what kinds do we look down at in terms of daily experience, but also with art. What kind of tones of support. I'll explain that in a second. But what kind of tones of critique should art make, or does make, or have? I've encountered recently this kind of statement that art being critical, or this kind of critique that Butler suggests, which is moldable, which is relational, etc., is actually a kind of a milder form of criticism that can't really be effective when you have such a harsh reality as we do, right? The form of criticism that we have to use here, this is something that I've heard a few times, has to be harsher, has to be more direct, has to have result, right? Has to be even cynical, has to take a certain tone to be able to. Art has to take a certain tone, or we have to, as writers or whatever, take a certain tone to be able to compare, or to be able to compete, or to be able to influence the reality. And this tone has to be very harsh and has to be very angry. And this I kind of see as criticism, as Butler sees it, as Butler puts it. And maybe the other side of that could be the introduction of an ironic mode of criticism. And when I think about irony and the way, versus cynicism, right? So maybe an ironic tone is more like a critique in terms of practicing irony means, I have to kind of embody a certain situation that's not my own. I'm doing something that's opposite, right, to what I do, just in order to demonstrate the way the system works. That is, to demonstrate the faults of the system through through embodying it or being it for a second. So this is also about the body, like in Alys's work. I feel like in Alys's work we have maybe not criticism, but very much an ironic gesture where you have just an artist walking along in these areas, like the exact opposite of what you would find there, painting the ground. And also in Hugonier's piece, I feel there's irony where she's adding the bust to the list of Oriental images, right? So we have the donkey, and now we have the tour bus. Now we have the tourist bus, right? So it's also within that landscape of Orientalism. It's again, and I think these kind of gestures that I would like to compare to Butler's critical mode, not criticism, is maybe something that art can offer us, or maybe something that we can practice more. But it's actually a question. It's not something that I wanted to say. Like, what kind of critical mode do you think is formed in these works or other works that you think are more effective? And what kind of critical possibilities can art offer us that can really be, effective?
Yeah, because the other, earlier you were asking me about sort of when I feel between inside and outside, and so I gave an example of a kind of sort of conservative, essentially a conservative position, but then I've also felt the same thing in activist circles where where I think there's an assumption of a rhetoric of activism that I was talking about, a rhetoric of being against something in a particular way. There's a visual rhetoric and also like a linguistic rhetoric that is assumed that if one sort of comes out, demonstrates, in a particular way, has your signs, and that it always will lead to some, the demonstration of an opposition is in and of itself a possibility. Right. But I do think that one of the things that artwork has the potential for is sort of imagining another way of thinking, another way of speaking, another way of representing the world in which we live, and I agree. I mean, I think that. As I mentioned, I think the Alys piece is more complex and yet so simple at the same time, and sort of revealing certain possibilities of a way of being, literally just walking. But at the same time, something that's sort of an absurd gesture and that's somewhat playful. But on the other hand, I think that the Zmijewsky piece ended up sort of being an opportunity for the same possibility, the same rhetoric of activism to make itself manifest. I mean,
manifest, but also maybe a little bit depressed, a little bit like.
I don't know. I mean, well, I don't know.
It became an image, right?
Yeah. No, it became its thing. I mean, a couple of days I was talking to Khalid Irani about this, and he was saying that when the key returned, they were so. They kept on the activists who at the camp who had organized this. They said that everyone in the camp kept on saying, "When are you going to bring our key back? When are you going to bring our key back? It's this hole in our heart. We need our key back," which is sort of like this double lack, right? Like the key is the symbol of the lack, but if they don't have the key, then they have nothing, right? So they needed the key back, and they needed it desperately. And so finally, when it's returned, it was a huge celebration that he said he hadn't seen anything like it before. Like certainly not when it left, which was also a huge celebration, but when it returned, it was this massive moment. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, Zmijewsky has promised all of these sort of educational activities and a center that would be about sort of actually rethinking the possibilities of signification of the Nakba. That ultimately, to even think through, well, what is the key, and are there other possibilities? And yet somehow the budget didn't allow, and they couldn't do it, and so all they had was the party for the thing that they lost in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question and a comment, and maybe somebody else will come after we get. First of all, I have no idea what that means. If there's a certain tone that writers and critics have to take when speaking about the Middle East, this angry tone that you mentioned, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Really?
I don't know if anybody else has that.
Nobody?
He said have to. I think, if I'm correct, he said that particularly CNN and Al Jazeera looked at that sort of tone from journalism.
But also, when did we build up this as a binary between art and news journalism?
Sure.
I also lost completely that train of thought, especially when we're talking about trying to break all these binaries.
Sure.
Two, if we're going to talk about the insiders and the outsiders, I'm really curious about if somebody's coming from North American Jewry
Right.
to Israel, what do they take back to North America? What is, if that is the place where they are an insider there, then what kind of infiltration or intervention they're doing where they are an insider, not where they are an insider.
Can you repeat the second question again?
Yeah. All the examples that you gave, let's say,
Yeah.
about an outsider coming in,
Right.
speaking here
Sure.
about the situation here. I'm wondering about the insider going back home,
Right.
speaking to their
The outsider.
community,
To their own community.
to the outside community where they're an insider.
Right.
What happens when you go back to Texas?
Yeah. Yeah. What happens when I go back to Texas? Well, actually, I became more aware. It's different going back to within the North American context, which in and of itself is a kind of paradigm in relationship to Israel. Obviously, there are multiple communities. So, like I existed within a kind of New York community in relationship to here, but for the past 10 years I've lived in Texas, and the primary relationship between Texas and here, while there is a Jewish community, is more Christian Zionist. And I've had a lot of students actually who start speaking Hebrew to me and talk about the and that they come here on the same tours that are somewhere between Artur Zmijewsky's pilgrimage video of the Christian tours and the Jewish agency tours, So, like, when I speak about these, my experiences here, it's filtered often through, like, a lens of the same preconceptions, that I was talking about when outsiders are here, right? So, like, there are people who are there who may not have ever been here, but still have various preconceptions. But it's still considered quite exotic, to like sort of the people who haven't been here often. Yeah.
Myself would like just
Please.
to ask the flip side of that
Yeah.
question, which is, looking around the room, I can tell most people live here. They're
Sure.
quote unquote insiders. If we're looking at, and that's another question, if nationalism is really the insider-outsider like default set of criteria or definitions that we're using, which can be complicated, obviously, as we know,
Sure.
but that's such a like elementary form of distinction. But what I want to know is, to the people in this room who are insiders, when we're talking about the political situation, like what can we really take back from that? Because I'm constantly thinking about. So I studied anthropology, and the first thing that you're supposed to do in anthropology is understand that when an anthropologist goes to the tribe somewhere far away, the people who are going to gravitate towards that person are going to be all the outsiders. So all the like crazy people, the freaks, the people with no friends, the losers, all the people who have beef with the whatever mainstream is, so that they have like an outside companion. So for all of us here listening to this stuff, like how do we can't boycott ourselves, or we can try, but, at least from my experience, I sort of tried it. What do we do? And I know that there were other questions here, so I don't know if you want to maybe get a few more questions.
And in what way can it be effective without, or maybe not without, being objectified or commodified? So,
I think this is a huge question within socially engaged practices right now. Tanya Bruguera has this project that she's been working on this past year with both the Queen's Museum and the Van Abbe Museum of Artur Thiel. Essentially, she, the relationship between art and life, which usually is thought about through Duchamp, of sort of taking the toilet out of the. I mean, some of you probably heard Tom Finkelberg give this example because he always does. Take the. You
didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Duchamp.
Right?
No, I'll finish it in a second. Take the toilet from the bathroom to the art gallery, and she wants to put it from the art gallery back into the bathroom. To sort of take something that has a relationship between art and life that's not going from life to art, but from art back into life. But at the same time, I think there is this constant awareness, and this is the difference to me between this notion of criticism and critique, of a kind of fluidity and a blurring of boundaries, which actually embraces a certain kind of inefficiency. Because I think that efficiency is tied to utility in this very didactic sort of way, that essentially, in the world that we live, we need to lay out a number of bullet points, and if you check off each of those bullet points, then you accomplish what you desired. But I think that art allows for the possibility of imagining multiple points in which that desire could potentially be fulfilled without actually ever getting there. And this is very different than the sort of utopianism I think that you were talking about in relation, the sort of Zionist roots of Israeli art, which were tied very much to modernism, which is sort of like, we will get there to this utopian end. So there's inherently an inefficiency with the desire to sort of push against it.
It could be also related to the autonomy or utopia, but actually what you were saying, that if we come back to the example of the artwork or the artist or the viewers themselves, they were referring to the possible wanted outcome of the artwork. So it's kind of like.
I don't think that's what we were saying. That's not what I was saying. I wasn't talking about an outcome. I was talking.
I wasn't saying that you were.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I was saying that you were talking about, for example, when they returned the key.
Yeah. Right.
They hadn't.
Sure.
A specific expectation.
Sure. But the expectation was of essentially opening a space of discourse. Right, like the expectation wasn't finite. The expectation was to a point of opening outward towards something that they didn't know what the end point would be. The expectation was the beginning of discourse to open out from the key as the finite symbol of the Nakba. To me, I think that was the expectation that to me that expectation is actually sort of is a paradigm for this sort of weird fluidity between something that's sort of efficient and yet inefficient at the same time.
And this also takes me to another point, which is we were talking about this earlier about how seldom we need a third place to kind of to do stuff that we can't do here, to kind of get together the two insiders, or the insider and the outsider, or the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 semi-insiders, outsiders. So we were talking about a third place, and it also reminded me of that huge question of is art a space? Is art like creating this kind of third spaces, or multiple spaces that can resist those binaries, or can actually allow, even in an imaginary way, for things to happen that don't happen in reality, and they can happen in an imaginary way, but still have an effect. This is what I meant by effect. Or is art just working within certain spaces, and has its own position in each space? It's a general question. Hi.
I'm sort of still forming this thought as I'm speaking, so forgive me if I'm not making much sense, but I'm kind of conflicted.
Can you come closer, maybe?
Kind of conflicted about this idea of the boycott, because I think that we were talking about insider, outsider, nationality, and things like that, and I think somehow the way Judith Butler and people that agree with her see it, it's sort of like a privilege for outsiders, people like Francis Alys and people like that to come to Israel and do something that's critical and poetic and come back and talk about it. But for people who are either Palestinians or Israelis, there isn't such a privilege. And for the insiders, they're sort of expected to be, represent their nationality, and usually are judged by their nationality. So what happens is that people are trying to create things that are critical, poetic, and good for both sides. But I guess I'm speaking here more about the Israeli side, because this is something that I'm feeling. Then they're judged differently. So, and you yourself said that the boycott, when what happened with the Digital Institute in Cologne, when created that, that the problem was that they weren't judged according to the content, according to the quality and the content and the radicality of what they did, but according to the fact that they're Israeli.
They would say that it is content, though. They would say that it is content, though.
They would say
that this fact, the BDS people would say that this is content, like being supported by or funded by.
Yeah, that's what I'm conflicted about.
Yeah.
Because I think that, I understand a lot of what they're saying, but I think that it's very problematic to be judged by who's financing you, and not by the content of what you're doing and the intent and what sort of criticality you're trying to create.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about a little bit is the question around the boycott that's connected to finance becomes very problematic if we think that essentially Israel's economy exists independent from a larger global capitalist system. Not just the global capitalist system that's predicated on, say, like U.S. aid, but also a system that that is really quite complicated and quite fluid. And one thing I've noticed is that, for a lot of artists in Beirut, for instance, that I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, were talking very much about sort of the problem of capitalism. It was very interesting to me that it wasn't a question about the war, about sort of recent memory of the war in 2006, etc. That the question was really about capitalism, and capitalism that wasn't just about the withdrawal of money from the Gulf in relationship to the war in Syria. That's a very real problem in terms of economy that has withdrawn support for artists in Beirut right now. But I think that this is also a question that I think, to me, this is the thing that, going back to the beginning, that I was trying to talk to these students at Shankar about, was like, because this was like immediately in the wake of the social protests here, which had been echoed, in places like, the Occupy movements in places like Spain and Greece, etc., and recently in Brazil. And I think that it would be very interesting to me to open up a conversation between the critique of global capital and its power structures, and the critique of various kinds of political powers, such as the occupation, and not to see them as distinct. I mean, I know that this was a rhetoric around the social protests, but I don't think it's just say, oh, the social protests need to deal with the occupation. It's also that both the social protests and the occupation need to look at themselves in relationship to a larger capitalist system that is subjugating a lot of people that are quite connected. I mean, I'm still forming this, but I think that, I mean, I've noticed like in 16 Beaver with Irene Anastas and Renee Gabri that they have gone more and more and more towards the question of capitalism, and less toward, it's a way...
And Walid Rad.
And Walid Rad as well, and I think that this is a way to get outside of because nationalism often can be used as a kind of specter to hide, the spectacle of capital. It's this thing that, that makes people seem like, oh, well, we're the same or we're different, but actually that there's class systems that move in a horizontal way across these nationalist identities.
Questions that were not answered yet.
Hans question.
Which one?
Hans question. What
Hans
should we do? You tell us.
Yeah, I don't think that's for me to answer. Maya's question about the North American or the first one?
What question?
There's another question here.
Okay.
I'll repeat that question, just a comment.
Yeah.
Again, thinking about it aloud right now, I mean, all this, the wall of tourism that we saw here in the last 10 years or so since they started being here was enormous. That we saw really dozens of artists from all over the world, more known, well-known,
Yeah.
coming to the work. Of course, lots of video, photography, performances. It was quite exciting for the first couple of days, but then it was quite ridiculous. And but in a way, what I'm thinking in terms of the outsider and the insider, is I think that the whole paradigm is it's very good to talk about inside or outside, because once you have the wall, but you can go on both sides indistinctly, then the wall for you is just a gesture. And every work you do is just a gesture. You're just indicating there's a wall. If you're playing tennis from one side or the other, if you're going with a green line, or driving with a car and shooting and listening, or painting, whatever it is, a series of works also. There's in every possible way. So I like that the inside and outside, because we are all outsiders, but only those who are inside and they cannot go outside. And then if you see the Palestinian works dealing with the war, that's something completely different. Those are the insiders. When you see the work documenting people going under the sewers to go on the other side, that's not a gesture.
Sure.
Those are the insiders. Or even when you see this little fragment of Aviv with the kids on the other side of the wall, that's not a gesture. Everything else basically is indicating there's a wall, there's a limit, there should be a limit, maybe, but there's nothing compromised that we can do while you can go both sides. You're always going to be an outsider. So this is my comment.
Yeah, and I'm finding this I agree with you, the sort of increasing ridiculousness, like especially as they layer one on top of the other. But I'm thinking also like about sort of the increase of biennial culture and the way that it has allowed like a kind of mobility of some, like I'm just thinking about like people, Palestinian artists who like go out to show in exhibitions external, but like get the visa or whatever to leave because of this other thing. But otherwise, other people who don't have that privilege, who sort of grew up in the same situation, and I'm not suggesting that essentially biennial culture is the savior of the Palestinian people, which is ridiculous. But it's interesting that there has been this possibility of being, of sort of having a release of feeling trapped on the inside, a release of being sort of walled in within this other thing. And I don't know that it's a true release. It could be a false release.
So it's like an ai Weiwei release.
I think the key.
Yeah.
The key word.
Yeah.
Of Zmijewsky precisely doing that.
Yes.
Because it's taking something that is a very strong symbol while it's there,
Right.
emptying of everything and
Yes.
becoming a gesture in a place where it's everything about something else, about somewhere else. And it's exactly what happened because of these biennials taking this huge symbol and making it completely empty.
Yeah.
It's a gesture.
That's why the Francis Alys work is very well received too. There's some honesty, there's some embedded honesty in the title of the book.
Right.
That this gesture that it's doing is obviously an indicator of something. It's like an example of some other kind of bigger logic. The title.
I agree totally.
To think, that I think about Sharon Hayes' work, for example, in that respect, where and that's somehow the most effective, like somehow the most effective works outside, and I think also inside is when there isn't like this pointing to, that's what she does. She uses the war in Iraq to discuss queer politics in the streets of New York. It's how she enters the Iraq war without saying that this work is about this, but she's using some other politics and inserts it from, the bottom up, which I think is interesting. And I think also that really don't like these terms insiders and outsiders.
Sure.
I think maybe we can use like a longer sentence that has to do with the word consequence.
Consequence?
Consequence. Like I think
Like what?
Why the finger comes up about artists that come from outside or from other countries who don't have personal relationship to this place, or they have their foreign passport. And this has to do with crossing borders as well. So this thing of consequence when you will not be the one to suffer them, and I think because we can be place of conflict. So I think that's another. I think that's another really. The only maybe it's like my ignorance, but the only work that I know that was made in Iraq was made by a Swedish artist, not an American artist. You know what I mean? Which I think is another issue. But when I started going there, then I started hearing myself kind of thinking about Edie's last speech, like about the why aren't you dealing with like Syria? So it always would go there. But I do think it's an issue. Like I'm asking why. For example, between 2004 and 2008, there were more American artists like dealing with the politics here than in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example.
Is that a fact, like, or it's a fact? Okay. No, I didn't know that.
I mean, I don't know literally if I'll take your word for it, but
just because I was in New York for those years,
sure.
And I saw some shows and museum shows, and like I have not seen one work except for the Sharon Hayes.
Yeah, and
certainly
and
seen so many dealing with this.
No, I think during the Bush years, like the post 9/11, I think that American intellectuals and American artists felt quite there was a lot of self-censorship, and I think there was a lot of sense of repression within that environment, and I think it's easier to sort of project on something that one feels less complicit with. That's a hypothesis. But just one thing I wanted to say about Sharon Hayes in relationship to the Francis Alys piece. Her most recent project in Venice is this interview with a bunch of students at Mount Holyoke College an all-women's college in the western Massachusetts, and she was modeling it on this sort of Pasolini film, like where he's interviewing people in the streets of Italy, and the thing that I thought was really fascinating about this is it's a group of women who have the same privilege to be at this private school and who chose to go to an all-women's college. And by simply asking questions, she provokes this kind of fascinating argument amongst them about, which ultimately provokes questions around global feminism. Sort of the, one woman is talking about sort of the, why are there always these men who want to penetrate our veil, our personal space, why is that so much better than someone dressing with less, like why is that freedom? That there became, also the difference between sort of a trans person who was actually at the school M to F and someone who was F to M, there became so many different positions in something that could have been thought of as being a very homogeneous group of people. And I think that to some degree the questions of nationalism and gender and desire that sort of work through that conversation, and all the pieces is a conversation amongst a group of young women, but it evolves into something that opens up sort of not only like our viewers' expectations of who these people are, but their expectations amongst themselves of who they are. And that's what I found interesting about the Alys piece, because I think the way most people think of it about it is simply the line, but I think that it's sort of the conversations that he's having, all the interviews that have implicit contradictions within them, that actually becomes really the heart of the piece, where it's not simply a single gesture, it's a single gesture that has multiple layers that don't have a clear answer, that actually unfurls it into something that's much more complex, that explodes any notion of inside or outside.
I think we have to, do we have time for one more?
I think we're kind of ignoring also the power structures of the art world. I mean, the fact that there was no budget for the Palestinian discussions around the key
Sure.
is not by chance. I mean, it's not by chance that in Germany they didn't find money to talk about Nakba. That's completely on purpose. And who is funding, the artists who are coming here, and who's not funding artists who want to talk about Iraq? I mean, you can't take critique of capitalism without talking critique of the capitalism of the art world and where the money is coming from.
I actually think it's vice versa. I actually think you have to realize that the art market is a very small niche within the general capitalism.
Talk about the sponsors.
Sponsors, it's the bigger agendas. It's the bigger agendas is what I think. That's what Noah was trying to say. I think so.
Yeah.
It's the bigger agenda we need to worry about, I think, and not the insider-outsider system of art, which only. I'm not saying it's not important. I think it's only echoing, other bigger systems, and it's only part of a much larger problem.
So it's echoing.
Okay.
Basta.
Thank you.